Welcome back to the class, and we are beginning the lectures in the fourth week of the course. And in this week, as well as in the next week, we are going to discuss a very central theoretical concern in the sociological theories on globalization, and that is the relationship between globalization and modernity. This is a very important and central theme in globalization debates, especially from a sociological and theoretical point of view, because you know that this whole debate about modernity and how do we describe them, how do we characterize them, when do we set the time period of modernity, when did it begin, when did it end, if at all it ended, and then what happened after that, how do we characterize the contemporary times in which we are living. So these are some of the important philosophical and sociological debates of our times, and literature on globalization also is not free from these debates. So there is an argument about the emergence of modernity in Europe, okay, in a particular time period because of a host of socio-economic and political reasons, and we attribute this enlightenment as one of the very important manifestations of modernity, and a set of institutions and set of new ideas and value systems. And then there are also people talk about the crisis of modernity, especially by the second half of 20th century. Then there is a rather consensus or kind of a conclusion that this phase, what we consider as modernity, came to an end by 1970s or 1980s. At the same time, this consensus is not completely free from the kind of debates, the kind of theoretical engagement, because there's a very substantial section of scholars believe that we have moved beyond, we have gone past that of modernity, and we have reached a stage of post-modernity. Okay? Whereas a discipline like sociology, or a large number of scholars within the discipline of sociology, of course they agree that modernity has, the very character of modernity has changed, but they are not ready to completely throw away this concept of modernity. So we will be discussing for this course three very important scholars who belong to that particular tradition, okay, who argues that modernity has undergone tremendous transformations, but we are not ready to say that we are in a completely postmodern world, because a postmodern world quite often indicates a complete break from that of the previous system. And these scholars whom we are going to discuss, namely David Harvey, Anthony Giddens, and Ulrich Beck, are not really belong to that particular category who celebrate the arrival of postmodernity. So before getting into the specific readings, especially of Anthony Giddens, we are going to spend a lot of time trying to understand his very influential work, The Consequences of Modernity. So before that, let me spend some time trying to give some broad picture about this whole idea of modernity, what it means to be modernity, and then how did sociology engage with that. Okay, so Anthony Giddens describes sociology as the study of modernity, a shorthand term for modern society or industrial civilization. And you know that sociology emerged as a modern science. Okay, it simply did not exist in the medieval period. It emerged in the Europe in the 18th and 19th century, beginning of and then later got institutionalized in the early 20th century. So it specifically is a study, is a branch of science or a branch of discipline that emerged in Europe with a very specific focus on the industrial or modern society. So in essence, Giddens would argue that it is nothing but a study of modernity. So this whole idea of modernity is something so close to the central theme of sociology. And modernity has produced by three important revolutions, and I am not going into the details because these are the very specific reasons why sociology as a discipline also emerged in the Europe during this particular time, during late 17th and late 18th and 19th and 20th century. So a set of attitudes towards the world, including the idea of the world as open to transformation by human intervention. Okay, so this idea, what we can make sense of under this term scientific revolution. So what did scientific revolution tell you? Scientific revolution argued that the world outside or the world around us is amenable to human intelligence. Okay, you can use your human intelligence to make sense of that, to understand that, to explain that. Okay, you don't really require any superhuman power. You don't really depend upon a transcendental power to make sense of that, or religious explanation, or magical explanation, or explanation based on magic or some supernatural powers. These things are no longer required. Okay, you don't need to depend upon Bible, you don't need to depend upon any of the religious scriptures to make sense of that. Human intellect, human rationality is capable of understanding the natural and physical phenomenon around you. And later that was extended to social realm. That is why sociology emerged as a science, a positivist science during its earlier phase. I am again not going to that. So its set of attitudes towards world, including the idea of the world as open to transformation by human intervention. You can not only understand that, but also you can intervene and you can change it. And second one, it's a certain range of political institutions, including the nation state and mass democracy. Okay, something that was brought into being by the French Revolution. Okay, the French Revolution is considered to be one of the most important historical epochs that overthrew the feudalism and then ushered in the period of democracy. Okay, so a set of new ideas and new institutions were brought into picture, especially an institution like nation state. Okay, now we don't have any other form of governance other than nation state, and nation state is a very modern phenomenon. Okay, nation state systematically displaced all the previous forms of political governance. Okay, so nation states and then mass democracy and then whole set of notions of citizenship, notions of rights, the whole ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity, all these things were brought to the table by that of French Revolution. And then of course you have the Industrial Revolution that swept across the Western Europe, a complex of economic institutions, especially industrial production and market economy. And these two things, industrial production as well as market economy, also they replaced the existing form of economic institutions, including that of feudal structure, including agrarian society, agrarian structures. So these traditional feudal-based agrarian economy was systematically transformed into an industrial-based, modern, market-based capitalist system. So these three revolutions are considered to be something so significant, okay, that happened within a very short period in time in Europe, giving rise to a completely different set of ideas of society, and which is also followed by the idea of the rise of rationality, positivist methodology, that you can use your reason in order to understand that. Okay, the world around you is amenable to your reasoning, your rationality. Okay, if each and everything you can question, you don't need to blindly believe what is given in the theology. And also the kind of a positivist methodology. Positivist methodology is the adoption of scientific methodology. Okay, and then the disenchantment of the world and the rise of secularism as a principle. Okay, so once you adopt this scientific methodology, the world, you are no longer enchanted by the world. Okay, you are no longer in the spell of some unseen force or unseen power to make sense of this whole world. You know how it works. You are not enchanted. You don't buy the argument that this whole universe is created by God and each and everything is decided by this supreme power. So you use your rationality to make sense of this world, and also you think that the religion has to be shown its place. So religion is made as a kind of a private affair. The role of religion, the scope of religion is very significantly curtailed as something that is limited to the private sphere of an individual. And then the discourse on the emancipatory project with notions of universal rights. This enlightenment values, enlightenment argument is highly emancipatory in its claim. Okay, most of these enlightenment scholars, they thought about human emancipation from the chains of the tradition, emancipation from the bonds, from the traditional bonds that have enslaved them. Okay, and they spoke about the universal rights as individual right, and then everybody is being equal, the notions of citizenship, all these ideas, and of course the discourse on human mastery over nature. So modernity was extremely optimistic in the sense that here comes an age where we are going to be the masters. We are going to have our unquestionable mastery over the nature. The nature was increasingly seen as a resource that needs to be kind of utilized, that needs to be used up by the sake of human beings. So this great transformation, so profound in its implication, gave sociological theory its reason for existence. So as I told you, sociology is nothing but a discipline of modernity, as Giddens argues. And this whole idea, the discovery of the idea of the social or society. So this is something very important again. So all these transformations brought home the point that there is something called as a social, as something very distinct, okay, which is no longer a residue of some other spheres of activity. Okay, the social cannot be reduced to economy. Social cannot be reduced to politics. Social cannot be reduced to, say, philosophy. Social cannot be reduced to, say, history. Okay, so a distinct sphere of human activity has to be studied on its own merit, and that is why you require a discipline to exclusively study this social or this society. So that is why when we say that sociology is the study of society, we say that it is not society in the general sense, but we look at the social, the nature of interrelationship within the society. The intellectuals came to recognize the existence of society as a supra-individual entity, a distinct phenomenon having its own specific characteristics, its constraints and its variables. So these intellectuals began to look at society as a supra-individual entity. Society is nothing but a group of people coming together, but when they come together, there is something more happens. You can't reduce a society to an individual. Of course, society functions through the individual, but the individual is not the society. It is something beyond an individual. Okay, it's something more and beyond an individual. So the individual themselves were products of society, and sociology as a study of modern society. And there are elaborate discussions on these three important scholars: Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. The first two are German, and Durkheim is a French sociologist, and how they are the foremost theorists of modernity. I am not going into the details about how did they conceive of modernity, how were they critical of modernity, but they lived, experienced, and reflected over the rise of modernity. And they applied the principles of science inherited from the Enlightenment to examine the origin, characteristics, and dynamics of modern society. Okay, so I hope you would have listened to some of the other courses, or I myself have given a course on classical sociological theories, in which I undertake a very elaborate discussion on Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, especially with questions related to their engagement with the question of modernity. So these are the three important people, the trinities of classical sociological theory, or the theories of modernity. Now, these are some of the central questions. What are the origins and defining characteristics of the new capitalist or industrial society? How does it differ from the traditional society of the past? Through what processes did the transition from the pre-modern world to the modern world come about? What are the driving forces and developmental tendencies of the emergent industrial society? What is the fate of the individual in the modern age? What new problems and dangers does the era of modernity pose? What does the future hold, and how might we best respond to the radically new circumstances of modern social life? These are some of the central questions of modernity as well as that of sociology. Chapter on modernity from the book titled Conditions of Postmodernity, written by David Harvey. So from this section onwards, this slide onwards, I am using a couple of paragraphs from a very important book by David Harvey titled The Conditions of Postmodernity. So these are the paragraph straightaway taken from this particular book. So Harvey argues that although the term modern has a rather more ancient history, what Habermas is a very important German, scholar, philosopher who passed away recently. So Kant calls the project of modernity came into focus during the 18th century in Europe. That project amounted to an extraordinary intellectual effort on the part of the Enlightenment thinkers, okay, to develop objective sciences, universal morality and law, and autonomous art according to their inner logic. Okay, so what were the important agenda of these Enlightenment thinkers? One is to develop objective science, okay, the science which tells you the truth, the science which is not influenced by any ideology or any theological positions about the fact, something that claims to give you an objective understanding of the world around you, and the universal morality and law. And most of these Enlightenment scholars claim to have identified a set of universal set of moralities and laws, and many of them even believed that sociology can be fashioned as a science which can think about universally applicable social laws, and autonomous art according to their inner logic. The idea was to use the accumulation of knowledge generated by many individuals working freely and creatively for the pursuit of human emancipation and the enrichment of daily life, especially in the fields of art. The scientific domination of nature promised freedom from scarcity, want, and the arbitrariness of natural calamity. So the scientific domination of nature, that we believed that we are able to tame the nature, we are able to control the nature, we are able to manipulate the nature for our own benefit. So if you look into some of the most important scientific innovations and discoveries, and which later translated into major technological innovations, all these things were aimed at providing far better comfort and luxury and access to human beings to the various aspects of nature. So it gave you enormous amount of optimism that we are now being able to control the nature. Okay, whether it is about constructing a dam or generating electricity from that, or n number of examples, whether it is about transportation, about aeroplanes, or about telecommunication, whatever we thought, we were of the very strong belief that we are able to tame the nature with the domination of nature, promise freedom from scarcity, okay, want, and the arbitrariness of natural calamity. The development of rational forms of social organization and rational modes of thought promised liberation from the irrationalities of myth, religion, superstition, release from the arbitrary use of power, as well as from the dark side of our own human natures. And this is the kind of a more ethical or moral dimension of modernity. Okay, modernity believed in the use of rationality. Okay, so once you begin to think through rationality, you think that human beings so far were living in a world of irrationality, and this irrationality was seen as as existing in the field of myth, magic, religion, superstition, tradition, everything. So modernity was seen as a rescuing of people, okay, lifting out of people from this world of ignorance and backwardness into that of the field of scientific rationality. Okay, so this has a very strong moral position as well, that which claims that the scientific worldview, scientific version of truth is more acceptable, it is more important, it is more objectively correct than any other alternative forms of reality. So, and also development of a series of rational forms of social organization, and for example, the nation state. Okay, so the nation state emerged during the period of modernity with a kind of a contract between the state and the citizen. So the citizen is supposed to do his or her duties and then the role, and the state is supposed to protect the citizen through the enactment of law, and then a series of other organizations like bureaucratic institutions. Okay, and rational modes of thought promised liberation from the irrationalities of myth, religion, superstition, release from the arbitrary use of power, as well as from the dark side of our own human nature. This is a very, very interesting point, because these people, Enlightenment thinkers, believed that once you begin to use your rationality, we no longer will be like this brute and nasty people. Okay, that is been kind of characterized by earlier thinkers. We will not be brute, we will not be violent, we will be more civilized people. Okay, we will not resort to unnecessary forms of violence. Okay, rather we will be more civilized and cultured people. Only through such a project could the universal, eternal and the immutable qualities of all humanity be revealed. Okay, so this was one of the important claims or beliefs or aspirations of modernity, and different people had different take on that. I am again not going into that. For example, Marx, how did Marx believe this particular process was very different from how, say, Durkheim believed it, or how Max Weber believed in that. We will see that slowly. So Enlightenment thought, and here I rely on Cassius' account, embraced the idea of progress and actively sought that break with history and the tradition which modernity espouses. It was above all a secular movement that sought the demystification and desacralization of knowledge and social organization in order to liberate human beings from their chains. Okay, so this is a very, very important argument. So Enlightenment embraced the idea of progress. So this whole idea of progress was seen and presented as one particular unitary way of reaching a particular predefined destination. And this idea of progress is very closely connected with this idea of unilinear evolutionary model that many of these early sociologists and then philosophers very strongly believed in. They all believed that every society is destined to follow a particular predefined path towards a higher state of affairs, and this higher state of affairs is characterized by the then existed Western European societies. So Western European societies were seen as the model towards which all other societies in the world are supposed to follow. Okay? So progress and actively sought that break with history and tradition which modernity espouses. So modernity was seen as a clear break from the tradition. It was above all a secular movement, as I mentioned earlier. Okay? It very specifically told religion to mind its own business. Okay? It wanted religion to be in the back, within the house. It wanted religion to be confined to the public, to the private sphere. It made this stark division between the private sphere and the public sphere. So you can be a believer, nothing wrong with it, but keep your religion within the four walls of your house. Make religion a kind of a personal engagement. Don't bring in religion to the realm of politics. Don't bring in religion to the realm of education or law or literature or other stuff. And demystification and desacralization of religion. Okay, so there is nothing anymore divine about a knowledge. Okay, so knowledge is no longer divine. Knowledge is no longer divinely ordained certain thing. Knowledge is no longer the monopoly of divinely selected group of priests or clergy. Knowledge is democratized. Okay, knowledge and social organization in order to liberate human beings from their chains. It took Alexander Pope's injunction, the proper study of mankind is man, with great seriousness, to the degree that it also lauded human creativity, scientific discovery, and the pursuit of individual excellence in the name of human progress. Enlightenment thinkers welcomed the maelstrom of changes and saw the transitoriness, the fleeting, and the fragmentary as a necessary condition through which the modernizing project could be achieved. So this large scale changes, okay, an unprecedented scale of changes. That's why they call it as this, the fleeting and the fragmentary. These moments are seen as something quite natural, something that is unavoidable. Okay, so all that is traditional will be wither away, will simply disappear. And doctrines of equality, liberty, faith in human intelligence, once allowed the benefit of education, and universal reason abounded. A good law must be good for everyone, pronounced Condorcet in the throes of the French Revolution, in exactly the same way that a true proposition is true for all. So these are some of the very radical, Enlightenment ideas that you believe in the doctrine of equality, that you believe that every human being deserves liberty, and you have faith in human intelligence, and you believe in the universal reason Okay, and it must be equally applicable to everybody. Now, so this was the kind of a promise of modernity, the project of modernity, something what still people call it as the unfinished project of modernity. If now sitting in 2020, if you look back and then see whether this promise has been materialized, okay, has it come true? The resounding answer is no. Okay, we have made tremendous progress. I'm not somebody who will be dismissive of the great achievements of modernity. Okay, because it's now become a fashion, or it has become quite easier to dismiss everything that is came as a result of modernity, and then say that everything was bad and modernity is completely violence. I don't subscribe to those arguments. So, but the kind of promise, the kind of uncritical optimism that the many of the champions of modernity espoused, okay, now seems to be discredited. It's no longer valid. So the 20th century, with its death camps and death squads, its militarism and the two world wars, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and its experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has certainly shattered this optimism. And we know that whether it is the First World War or Second World War, and most importantly the Hitler's Germany, the genocide, the Nazi movement, that is precisely rational. Okay, they used scientific rationality to wipe out millions of people from the earth from the face of the earth. So and then we saw the military power happening. We saw Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that really brought in quite a lot of questions about all these kind of claims. Okay, that the science is the savior, rationality is the savior, technology is the savior. We are going to have a bright future. We are going to be less violent. We are going to be less. Our history is going to be less bloodied. So all these kind of claims seems to be shattered by the second half of 20th century. Worse still, the suspicion lurks that the Enlightenment project was doomed to turn against itself and transform the quest for human emancipation into a system of universal oppression in the name of human liberation. Okay, so what are you doing in the name of emancipation to other people? Okay, so that even colonialism was justified. Colonialism was justified. Colonialism was legitimated with this kind of claims that we have come here to uplift you. We have come here to modernize you. We have come here to take you to the path of progress. So similarly, many of these claims of modernity was seen as a violent imposition on the cultures of vast majority of people who otherwise were contented with different kind of cultures. So a series of uniform mechanisms and worldviews and institutions were imposed on completely different kind of cultural groups with quite a lot of violence. This was the daring thesis advanced by Horkheimer and Adorno in their thesis, The Dialectics of Enlightenment. Okay, so it's a very important work which talks about the kind of a negative as well as positive implications of or value orientations of Enlightenment. Writing in the shadow of Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia, they argued that the logic that hides behind Enlightenment rationality is a logic of domination and oppression. Okay, how could a political ideology that emerged from Marxian notion of human emancipation could turn into one of the most autocratic and most violent forms of political ideology? Okay? How could a ruler like Hitler could execute millions of people, okay? Millions of people without any prick of conscience? How could he have his own subordinates and other ordinary Germans to do this kind of inhuman acts? So they argued that that hides behind Enlightenment rationality is the logic of domination and oppression. The lust to dominate nature entails the domination of human beings, and that could only lead in the end to a nightmare condition for self-domination. The revolt of nature, which they posited as the only way out of the impasse, had then to be conceived as a revolt of human nature against the oppressive power of purely instrumental reason over culture and personality. So this whole idea of instrumental reason that we are going to discuss in the coming slide as well is something very, very important. Okay, so we all celebrate rationality, but what if rationality is taken to the extreme, and then we don't care about ethics, we don't care about people, we don't care about certain kind of values, we don't care about the nature, we only want things to be done in the most efficient manner. And with a system like capitalism, that with its never-ending demands and desires, okay, how do you make use of these technologies to ensure that you employ this kind of rationality, and that kind of rationality can be extremely violent. So now another, continuing with that, whether or not Enlightenment project was doomed from the start to plunge us into a Kafka's world, whether or not it was bound to lead us to Auschwitz and Hiroshima, and whether it has any power left to inform and inspire contemporary thought and action are crucial questions. Okay, so what happened to this whole project was this Enlightenment idea. Rationality was supposed to lead to all these kind of concentration camps, and then Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and these are important questions. There are those like Habermas who continue to support the project, albeit with a strong dose of skepticism over aims, a lot of anguish over the relationship between means and ends, and a certain pessimism as to the possibility of realizing such a project under contemporary economic and political conditions. And then there are those, and this is, we shall see, the core of postmodernist philosophical thought, who insist that we should, in the name of human emancipation, abandon the Enlightenment project entirely. Which position we take depends upon how we explain the dark side of our recent history and the degree to which we attribute it to the defects of Enlightenment reason rather than to a lack of its proper application. So this is the crux of this whole idea. Okay, there are people including Habermas and including Giddens and Ulrich Beck, who still are not ready to throw away the concept of modernity or this whole idea of emancipatory project. They know that it has ran into problem. Okay, the science and technology and these universal ideas, the universalism has become quite violent, but they are not ready to throw it off. But there are another very substantive or very influential set of people who believe that Enlightenment project and this whole idea of emancipation must be thrown away, who insist that we should, in the name of human emancipation, abandon the Enlightenment project entirely. Which position we take? Yeah, so which position we take depends upon how do you define what the kind of a darker side. Okay, so it's not an easy question. Now, for example, the postmodernist would want a celebration of divergence, a celebration of differences. Okay, very important argument. But again, these whole ideas of equality, ideas of liberty, ideas of fraternity are some of the very important core ideas which I don't think that any society can really overlook. Now, Weber argued that, so this is again a quote by Bernstein. He kind of summarizes Weber, and this from the same book by David Harvey, the Postmodern Condition. Weber argued that the hope and expectations of the Enlightenment thinkers was bitter and ironic illusion. They maintained a strong necessary linkage between the growth of science, rationality, and universal human freedom. But when unmasked and understood, the legacy of the Enlightenment was the triumph of purposive instrumental rationality. Purposive instrumental rationality. This form of rationality affects and infects the entire range of social and cultural life, encompassing the economic structures, law, bureaucratic administration, and even arts. The growth of purposive instrumental rationality does not lead to the concrete realization of universal freedom, but to the creation of an iron cage of bureaucratic rationality from which there is no escape. This is an extremely important point that Weber re-emphasized again and again. Okay, if you take this whole idea of instrumental rationality to an extreme level in the name of efficiency, okay, because you usually use rationality for realizing efficiency. So in order to make efficiency, if you use rationality blindly, okay, it can have very, very negative, catastrophic consequences. And that will create a completely inhuman world with catastrophic consequences on the society, on the nature, on everything. Because an instrumental rationality, while it ensures more efficiency, it also results in complete lack of empathy, complete lack of kindness, understanding moral issues, ethical issues, value systems, people's choices, people's opinion. All these things are seen as unnecessary impediments for the execution of the most rational, instrumental rational decision. And we are seeing it today. We are seeing it today in every aspect of social life. We are able to see that. So Weber, one of the greatest theorists of modernity, greatest theorist of rationality, he himself was extremely cautious about this thing that is going to happen. That is why he called it as an iron cage, which is something that very difficult for you to escape from. Okay, so let me stop here, and this is a very very broad overview of this whole idea of modernity, and we will continue the discussion with the readings of Anthony Giddens from the next class onwards, and we are discussing his book, the Consequences of Modernity. That we will take some time, a couple of hours, to discuss that book in detail. Okay, so see you then. Thank you.